Housing is a human right. First home buyers shouldn't have to compete against cashed up investors who are getting massive taxation concessions. Guess what? Two political types have come out and started spreading this kind of nonsense. And frankly, it has to stop. Don't they know that all that matters in Australia is ultra high house prices? No matter how expensive they are, they need to become more expensive. Future generations are just gonna have to be pushed towards poverty so that wealthy property owners are able to buy more properties and become more wealthy. I'm Biko Konstantinos, and that's what we're going to talk about today. What's brown and sticky? A stick! What's brown and sits on a piano stool? Beethoven's Last Movement. Before we talk about overhauling property tax, you could overhaul your life right now and subscribe to my channel. Yes, it could be the worst decision you ever make, but that's how we learn. And liking this video will help the YouTube algorithm to maybe share it to more people. Now let's hear why these crazy people want to overhaul property tax, which goes completely against the Australian Constitution, which says ultra high house prices are a property owner's right and must be artificially inflated at all costs.
Labor Housing Minister Rose Jackson and retired Liberal Planning Minister Rob Stokes united in their calls for bold action to address the housing crisis.
So we've got Labor and Liberal teaming up together. Who would have thought that a housing crisis could bring rival political parties together for a shared cause? So we've got the current Labor Housing Minister, Rose Jackson, along with the former Liberal Minister for Planning, Rob Stokes. Now they're both from New South Wales, which we know has a basket case of a housing market, where unlivable shacks miles away from the city sell for easily over $1 million. I'd class Sydney as the housing affordability disaster of the developed world. So it's quite telling that two politicians from New South Wales are seeing past their political differences to try to actually make a difference in housing. Let's hear what they have to say.
Housing should not be seen as a financial asset. It should be seen as a fundamental human right.
Housing shouldn't be seen as a financial asset? Whoa! From the moment Australians are born, our parents tell us to buy property because it always goes up in value. Getting on the Australian property ladder is more important than finishing year 12, then going to uni, then getting a full-time job. It's all that matters, baby, because that's the only way you're going to get ahead in this country. Because house prices here rise way faster than wages, and because you can loan so much to buy property, there's very few other ways that you could make that much money. For example, if you're able to buy your first home and it's worth $1 million, and that home goes up 10% for that year, you've then made $100,000 tax-free. So that amount of gain that your home has made is the equivalent of someone working full-time and earning around $130,000 because they then have to pay tax on their wages. And because this sort of crazy house price growth has been happening for the last 3 decades, property in Australia most definitely is a financial asset. And because of that, the Australian dream is to own as many properties as you possibly can.
More!
And it doesn't matter how much debt you get into, because property always rises in Australia.
Solving our present housing crisis is not a simple formula of demand and supply.
What? The Albanese government says it's all about supply.
We know the big challenge in this country is housing supply.
We don't have enough supply because we're importing record levels of new migrants. So we need to bring more migrants in to build houses for the additional migrants that already came. Something about that just didn't add up. Anyway, the Australian government's only solution to this housing crisis is to somehow build way more houses. And this is at a time where we've seen record construction companies collapse. And we've got this Rob Stokes guy saying it's not all about supply and demand. Okay, Rob, I'm listening.
No longer bound by party politics, Stokes is calling for changes to incentives for investors.
Uh-oh, you better not be going after property investors, Rob. This housing cash cow has delivered year after year. Don't mention any changes that could potentially stop the flow of massive tax-reduced gains. For goodness sakes, Rob, the people will turn against you. Nobody really cares that renters are currently suffering from the worst housing crisis in history that's delivered the lowest rental vacancy rates ever, which means that many hardworking Australians have no housing security and some are even being made homeless. But that doesn't matter because only 1/3 of Australian households rent. What matters is the 2/3 of Australians who own property and bloody well expect that property to rise, because that's the Australian way, baby. And we don't want ridiculously small rises that are around the same amount as wages rise. We need property to outperform nearly every other asset because the government and the RBA is going to prop it up if anything goes wrong. So you better not be thinking of changing housing taxation policies, Rob. Remember what happened to Bill Shorten, who had the audacity to think the same sort of things? The Australian public turned on him like a rabid pack of wolves protecting their prize, which in this case is the golden goose called the Australian housing market.
Surely we need our tax system to enable opportunity for everyone to have secure access to one home before incentivising a minority to have many.
This is absolute craziness and I can't believe I'm hearing it. It's way more important that someone with 10 properties can buy their 11th rather than someone trying to buy their first home. We need would-be home buyers stuck in the rental market so that landlords are able to buy more properties, because this is just the Australian way. And of course property investors should get more special incentives that allows them to keep buying more property, because those incentives allow them to bid more for property, which means they can outcompete everyone else. But more importantly, it means that property prices can keep going up exponentially because property investors have more and more buying power. Stuff those pesky first home buyers, especially young people and future generations. Just because you were born at the wrong time doesn't mean that the great Australian property train can stop to try and let you on. You missed the train, baby. That's just tough titties.
Arguing both negative gearing and the capital gains discount.
Yep, he went there. Even the mention of a change to negative gearing or capital gains tax discount can get you locked up, son. Why? No one mentions those things and gets away with it.
That encourage speculation and incentivise housing investors to take on debt and inflate prices for first home buyers.
Of course it encourages speculation, and of course it inflates house prices, because that's exactly what we want. Without speculation, you wouldn't have crazy demand for property. It creates desperation and fear of missing out for those who don't own a property, which just gets added to the demand for those who already own property but want to own more property, which altogether leads to beautiful speculative house price gains. And what's more Australian than that? Let's consider negative gearing. Negative gearing allows the owner of an investment property to deduct the net cost of owning the property against their other income. So you buy an investment property, your expenses for that property are more than the income you receive, so you get a tax deduction, which helps to keep that investment property, but also helps to buy more investment properties, even if at first they'll be losing money. Paul Keating previously described negative gearing as an outrageous rort. He said the government cannot continue to tolerate a situation in which the general body of taxpayers effectively subsidizes the property investments of usually high-income taxpayers. Yeah, but many people will say if you get rid of negative gearing, there'll be less supply for renters, so rents will go way up. But guess what? The vast majority of negative gearing tax concessions are claimed on established homes. So it means no new supply is getting added to the housing market, and an investor has just purchased an existing property. And people say, yeah, but it's creating a rental. But it doesn't change the amount of properties. So if it wasn't an investor buying that property, then potentially a first home buyer could have bought it, which means that there's one less rental required. That's the big problem with that supply argument against negative gearing. gearing. Now let's consider the capital gains tax discount. Originally introduced by John Howard in 1999, it was meant to encourage a greater level of investment, particularly in innovative high-growth companies. However, instead of pouring into these high-growth companies, the vast majority of investment money flooded into housing because it was so much easier to borrow for. It was almost as though the Australian tax system was screaming at taxpayers to loan as much as they could to buy property to make increased capital gains rather than trying to work harder to earn increased wages. And isn't that a perfect reflection of the current Australian housing market, where you can indeed make more from your properties going up in value that you could at any regular job? Now, a New South Wales submission by the Liberal Party, mind you, stated that owner-occupiers, including first home buyers, were basically being pushed aside from home ownership by tax-advantaged investors who mostly were already on high incomes. The submission stated that by encouraging investors to buy and hold property, the 50% capital gains tax discount increases investor demand for housing and pushes first home buyers out of the market. So the thinking at the time would have been Australia will hopefully produce some innovative startup companies. Maybe they list on the stock market and people could invest in them, hold them for over 12 months, and then get the capital gains tax discount. But guess what? Hardly any of that happened, because you can borrow way less to buy shares, but you can borrow to the hilt to buy property. And also because of government and central bank support, the risk falls to almost zero. Capital gains tax discount encourages speculation, and combined with negative gearing, has turned the housing market into a speculative play toy for those who already own property. I think everyone knows deep down that the Australian housing market is fundamentally broken and massively benefits those who already own property or those who are on very high incomes, because they can take advantage of ultra generous tax concessions like negative gearing and capital gains tax discount. But on top of that, the effect of these policies just create incredible speculative demand for property, which has caused house prices to greatly outperform wages for around 30 years. And because of this, housing has become more and more unaffordable, so it's become more and more difficult for each successive generation to actually buy a home. And remember, secure housing should be a human right. But if you run policies that stimulate the crap out of the housing market, cause crazy speculation, desperation, and fear of missing out, then the result will be hardworking Australians who can't even afford to buy their own home. And that, my friends, is an absolute disgrace. I'm Biko Konstantinos.